Nicholas II was born on May the 18th or May the 6th in the 1868 Julian calendar. He was the last emperor of Russia, king of Poland, and Grand Duke of Finland. He is also known as Saint Nicholas the Passion Bearer by the Russian Orthodox Church. Finally, he was called Nicholas II, Emperor and Autocrat of all the Russias. The son of Alexander III, he ruled since the death of his father on November 1, 1894, until his abdication on March 15, 1917. During his reign, he saw Russia deteriorate from a world power to an economic and military disaster. As head of state, he approved the military mobilization of August 1914 that heralded the first fatal step toward World War I, the Revolution, and consequent fall of the Romanov dynasty. In the late 19th and 20th centuries, Russia was the world's sixth largest country. About 130 million subjects were spread over this area, not only Slavs, but also Balts, Jews, Germans, Georgians, Armenians, Uzbeks, and Tatars. In 1891, the imperial government launched the construction of Russia's largest railroad, the Trans-Siberian Railway, a railroad that started in the center of Moscow and stretched for 6,500 kilometers. At the time, Moscow was not the empire's capital, as it lost this status when Peter the Great built St. Petersburg in the early 18th century. In the 19th century, the Russian autocratic regime had been going through a series of challenges, but Tsar Alexander III, father of Nicholas II, apparently knew how to make the system work. The Tsar was Russia's government. His power was absolute, being accountable only to God. Power flowed from top to bottom throughout the empire. Alexander III increased his authoritarian views after his father, Tsar Alexander II, was assassinated. Alexander II had reformist positions and, thanks to this, was murdered by a group of anarchists. After this, Alexander III took over the throne and started persecuting revolutionary groups in Russia. Nicholas II's mother was Dagmar of Denmark, the younger sister of Princess Alexandra, who married the Prince of Wales and became Queen of England. Before she married, Dagmar took the Russian name Maria Fedorovna. The Tsarina was a woman beloved by the Russian people. Nicholas was born on May the 18th, 1868, followed by 4 other brothers. Thanks to his father's harsh and parched attitude, Nicholas found a safe haven in his mother. Nicholas was educated by tutors. He had teachers of foreign languages, history, geography, and a dance teacher. In many ways, the prince's education was excellent. He had a remarkable memory and did very well in history. He spoke French and German, and his English was so good that an Oxford professor could take him for an Englishman. In addition, he enjoyed horseback riding, dancing, and shooting. At 21, Nicholas was a slender young man, 5 feet 7 inches tall, sporting his father's squarish, open face, expressive eyes, and his mother's charisma. His greatest qualities were kindness, goodness, and friendship. Most of the time, Nicholas didn't have anything to do at all. Once he finished his studies and came of age, a Tsarevich's essential role was to wait as discreetly as possible for his turn to become Tsar. In 1890, Alexander III was only 45 years old. Thinking that he would continue to hold the throne for another 20 or 30 years, he did not think of passing on his experience to a son to succeed him. Nicholas happily accepted the playboy role to which he had been tacitly appointed. He attended the meetings of the Imperial Council, but his eyes were glued to his watch. At the first opportunity, he ran away. Nicholas had a few girlfriends in his youth, but his heart beat faster for a tall, golden-haired Germanic princess named Alex of Hesse. Princess Alex was the younger sister of the Grand Duchess Elizabeth, the 25-year-old wife of Grand Duke Sergei, Nicholas's uncle. Nicholas often went to his young aunt's house, and when his sister Alex arrived in St. Petersburg, his visits became even more frequent. Self-possessed and shy, Alex was ablaze inside. When she laid her stark, blue eyes upon Nicholas, he was overwhelmed with emotion. Unfortunately, she lived far away in Hesse-Darmstadt, and her parents hardly considered the marriage of a Russian Tsarevich to an obscure Germanic princess a possibility. In 1892, Nicholas wrote in his diary, "My dream is to marry Princess Alex someday. I have loved her for a long time, even more strongly and deeply since 1889, when she spent 6 weeks in St. Petersburg." The Russian people certainly did not love the princess as much as Nicholas did. She made a terrible impression during her stay at her sister's house. Ill-dressed, clumsy, bad dancer, awkward accent, overly shy and nervous, these were some of the comments about the princess. Society openly criticized the princess because they knew that the Tsar and the Tsarina were openly anti-German and had no intention of authorizing this marriage. Through it all, Nicholas maintained his hopes of marrying his sweetheart. He even went so far as to lose his way to see her and ask for her hand in marriage. While he was still healthy, Alexander III ignored his son's intentions. But in the winter of 1894, the Tsar contracted the flu and started having problems with his kidneys. When his vitality started to decline at an alarming rate, Alexander suddenly had to think about how Russia would manage without him. So Nicholas's parents allowed him to ask for Alex's hand in marriage. In 1893, Nicholas was sent to London, representing the family at the wedding of his cousin brother, George, Duke of York, later King George V, to Princess Mary of Teck. It was his first visit to London. As for his cousin George, he and the Tsarevich looked so much alike that even people who knew them mistook them for one another. After the wedding, Nicholas visited Windsor Castle and had lunch with Queen Victoria. The following year, Alex's older brother got married in Coburg. All the royal families sent delegates to this celebration. Nicholas would be the Russian representative, and he was not only going to stand for his country, but he also had the country's permission to ask for his beloved Alex's hand in marriage. And so he did. However, the girl did not accept at first. She was deeply confused by the idea of quitting her religion and adopting another. Alex's sister then talked to the girl and told her about her experience in changing religions, saying that it was not unusual. The next day, Alex decided to accept. Overjoyed, Nicholas wrote in his diary, "A wonderful, unforgettable day. Today's the day of my engagement to my dear, lovely Alex." Early the next morning, the engaged couple went to have breakfast with Queen Victoria and tell her the news. Victoria was delighted with the young couple. After 10 days together, Nicholas returned to Russia. The young couple would marry in November 1894. The preparations were in full swing. But a sad piece of news hit Russia. Tsar Alexander III died on November the 1st of that year. At the age of 26, Nicholas inherited the Russian throne. Nicholas declared himself unprepared for the responsibility and asked everyone what he was going to do. By late afternoon, he was His Imperial Majesty Tsar Nicholas II. The next morning, solely in the presence of the imperial family, Alex was consecrated to orthodoxy. When they returned to the palace, Tsar Nicholas issued his first imperial decree, proclaiming the faith, the new title, and the new name of the former princess Alex of Hesse. The Lutheran granddaughter of Queen Victoria became the truly believing Grand Duchess Alexandra Feodorovna. The death of the powerful Tsar Alexander III at 49 came as a surprise to all of Russia. The wedding had to go ahead of schedule. At first, the new Tsar preferred something more discreet to observe the mourning period. But his aunt and uncle told him that this wedding was a major event for all of Russia, and it had to be elaborate as possible. For Alex, the wedding was nothing more than a mere continuation of her father-in-law's funeral rituals. The wedding took place on November the 26th, a week after the burial. The day chosen was the birthday of Empress Mary, now the widowed empress, as the protocol for the occasion allowed a brief respite from mourning. There was no reception after the ceremony, and no honeymoon due to the mourning. The marriage that began that day proved to be perfect for the rest of their lives. It was a Victorian wedding, externally quiet and conventional, but based on intense and passionate physical love. On their wedding night, before going to sleep, Alexandra wrote in her husband's diary, "Finally united, bound for life, and when this life is over, we will meet in the next world and be together for eternity. Yours, yours." It was 1896. The 12-month mourning period was over, and the new Tsar was to be crowned in May in Moscow. The coronation of a Russian Tsar was strictly dictated by history and tradition, so it was to be held in Moscow, the former imperial capital. The city was buzzing. Besides the excitement, the revelry, and the banquets, the coronation meant a 3-day holiday, pardon of prisoners, and amnesty from fines and taxes. The coronation ceremony lasted 5 hours. After the long mass, the formal anointing of the Tsar and Tsarina followed. Alexandra knelt, and the Metropolitan of Moscow prayed for the Tsar. All present stood, and only Nicholas knelt and prayed for Russia and her people. After being anointed with holy oil, Nicholas took the oath to rule the empire and uphold the autocracy as emperor and autocrat of all the Russias. According to tradition, Nicholas was to crown himself, and he did so. He placed on his head the 4-kilo imperial crown made in 1762 for Catherine the Great. After this, Alexandra was crowned. In Moscow, the day after the coronation belonged to the people. The Grand Duke Sergei, the city's governor-general, had made arrangements for the traditional open-air celebration, attended by the Tsar and Empress in a nearby field. The night before, thousands had already gone to the field, without even bothering to sleep beforehand. By dawn, 500,000 people were waiting, many drunk. Suddenly, a rumor occurred that there would be fewer wagons than expected, and only those who arrived first would have beer. The rush began. The Cossack squadron in charge of keeping order was pushed to the side. Men hurled each other, stumbling into the ditches. Women and children, run over by the surging and pushing human mass, were trampled on the head and back. Noses and mouths were pressed against the ground. Thousands of feet continued to relentlessly trample the mutilated, suffocated bodies. The balance was thousands dead and wounded. However, a ball was to be given to the Tsar that night. At first he refused, but his uncles persuaded him to attend. Tragically, the Tsar went to the ball, something that the public took very poorly. Thousands of humble Russians understood the tragedy as a harbinger of misfortune for the reign. Others said that the Tsar was a ruthless man. After the coronation, the monarch was expected to travel on official and courtesy visits to other rulers. In the summer of 1896, Nicholas and Alexandra went to Vienna and then to England to visit Queen Victoria. During this journey, the Tsar passed through France and renewed the alliance that had been made during the reign of Nicholas's father. It was the Triple Entente being formed against Germany. At Versailles, Marie Antoinette's chambers were given over to Alexandra for a night's stay. Back home, Nicholas was thrust into, in his own words, "the horrid work that I have dreaded all my life." His mother still held him in this task. Much more difficult for Nicholas were his uncles, Alexander III's 4 surviving sons, Vladimir, Alexei, Sergei, and Paul, the uncle who caused Nicholas no trouble. It was not surprising that the uncles had such influence. All were energetic and relatively young when the 26-year-old nephew suddenly became Tsar. The uncle's influence continued throughout the reign's first decade. Only when Nicholas faced the barrage of the war against Japan and the 1905 revolution did the uncle's influence begin to weaken. Although he excelled in English, French, and German, Nicholas preferred to speak Russian with his children and wrote to his mother that way. He spoke and wrote English only with the Empress, whose Russian was mediocre. He preferred that his ministers also communicate using the Russian language. He liked to read Russian authors and had Alexei the Peaceful as his favorite Tsar. Nicholas's main features as a Tsar were acquired during those first years of his reign. Ascending unprepared to the throne, he was forced to develop his administration as he governed. Because he had been influenced by several people in his family, his enemies said that he had no will of his own. To the chagrin of Russian liberals who hoped that Alexander III's death would mean a change to the autocracy, Nicholas soon made it clear that he would respect his father's principles. Even before his coronation, he was already pushing this idea. Even with the French alliance, which he only became privy to upon taking the throne, Nicholas sought an international agreement for disarmament and world peace, which led to the establishment of the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague. This proposal, however, dumbfounded Europe. They laughed in Nicholas's face and didn't even bother to debate the proposal. The first years of Nicholas's reign proved to be a period of such brilliance, intellectual and cultural achievements that it became known as the Russian Renaissance, or the Silver Age. The bustling of activity and new ideas spanned not only politics, but philosophy, the sciences, music, and the arts. Over these years, the Tsar's family grew rapidly. At 2-year intervals, 3 more girls were born: Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia. Along with the births, there were both illnesses and deaths. In the summer of 1899, at the age of 27, Nicholas's brother, Grand Duke George, died of tuberculosis. In the fall of 1900, Nicholas fell ill with typhoid fever himself in the Crimea. Alexandra took care of him personally. The moment Nicholas recovered, Queen Victoria died. Alexandra had wanted to participate in the wake and burial, but she was pregnant with Anastasia, so she was denied permission. Another very important relative of the Tsar was the Kaiser of Germany, Wilhelm II. He was 8 years older than Nicholas and became Kaiser in 1888, 6 years before Nicholas became Tsar. Accordingly, he had the advantage of experience, was older, and more vigorous. For 10 years, from 1894 to 1904, the Kaiser manhandled Russian foreign policy, influencing the young and susceptible Tsar. That did not turn out well for the Tsar. The main catastrophe was the embarrassing defeat to Japan in a war. Back in those days, every country had expansionist dreams, and Russia was no different. Wary of the union between Russia and France, Wilhelm wanted to make the Tsar interested in Asia, and so he made him look at Japan. In 1900, during the Boxer Rebellion, Russia temporarily occupied Manchuria. After that, it went in search of the Korean peninsula, but Japan regarded this peninsula as essential for its protection. The Russian breakthrough in Korea made war against Japan inevitable. The Japanese would have preferred a deal, letting Manchuria remain with Russia and Korea clear for themselves. But the Japanese ministers could not stand by and watch the Russian advance. People in Russia took it for granted that, if there was a war, they would easily win it. It was the beginning of a dream, but it all went terribly wrong. On February 6, 1904, the war started. Japan suddenly attacked the Russian fleet at Port Arthur. They won the sea with this sneak attack. To attack the Japanese, the Russian had to travel a single 6,500-kilometer route via the Trans-Siberian Railway. Having guaranteed the sea, the Japanese expeditionary forces were free to land wherever they wanted on the continent. In St. Petersburg, Nicholas was stunned by the disaster. Acknowledging that Russia was powerless to win the war, the Tsar asked the United States for help in brokering a deal. Beaten and embarrassed by the Japanese, the Russian giant tottered back to Europe. Also, Russia was no longer the neighbor to be feared by the Germans. Wilhelm felt he could count on Nicholas's friendship and tried to get him to break the alliance with France. He refused this and tried to drive his double-crossed friend away. By 1905, he had lost the war, and his country was quickly descending into revolution. In early January 1905, news of the humiliating surrender sparked a wave of protests against war mishandling that swept the country. In St. Petersburg, a small strike in the huge Putilov steelworks suddenly spilled over, drawing the support of thousands of disgruntled and disillusioned workers. The workers had the objective of marching to the Winter Palace and delivering a petition on the behalf of the Russian people to the Tsar. Besides liberation, the petition specifically called for a constituent assembly, universal suffrage, separation of church and state, amnesty for political prisoners, income tax, minimum wage, and an 8-hour workday. The Tsar, who was in Tsarskoye Selo, had been given no information about the march or the petition. Only on Saturday night did Nicholas learn about it. On Sunday morning, January the 22nd, 1905, the march began in a freezing wind. With joined arms, they walked peacefully through the streets in joyful streams. The people gathered in front of the Winter Palace at 2 o'clock in the afternoon as scheduled. There was not a single skirmish with the troops. However, without any warning and no sign of riot, the soldiers opened fire. The bullets hit men, women, and children. The official death toll was 92, and many hundreds more were wounded. The real number was probably higher. This became known as Bloody Sunday, the turning point in Russian history. It shook old, legendary beliefs that the Tsar and people were one and the same. In Tsarskoye Selo, Nicholas was perplexed to learn what had happened. "A painful day," he wrote that night. The ministers gathered and suggested disassociating the Tsar from what had happened, stating that the troops fired without an order. Nicholas refused to defame the army and instead decided to welcome some representatives of trade unions. But Bloody Sunday was only the beginning of a year of terror. 3 weeks later, in February, Grand Duke Sergei, Nicholas's uncle and Ella's husband, was assassinated in Moscow. As the months passed, the violence spread to every part of Russia. It was at this point that the sailors of the battleship Potemkin mutinied and started bombing cities. In mid-October 1905, all of Russia was paralyzed by a general strike. Red flags waved through the cities. In the countryside, peasants stormed farms. The Soviets came into being overnight, and a clever orator emerged as their leader. He was Leon Trotsky, a Marxist member of the Social Democratic Party. The revolution was ready. It only needed a spark. Only two paths were open to the Tsar: find an energetic soldier to crush the rebellion by force, which would entail bloodshed, or give the people civil rights, freedom, and a constitution. This was not without risk, but it would be the only way out at that point. Accordingly, on October 30th, 1905, Russia was converted from an absolute monarchy into a semi-constitutional monarchy. A parliament, the so-called Duma, would be elected. It was not as liberal as England's constitutional monarchy, but it was already a step. During all the months of the war with Japan and the 1905 revolution, Nicholas and Alexandra had only one brief moment of utter joy. On August 12, 1904, Alex gave birth to a baby boy. The child was given the name Alexei. The boy was born weighing 3.6 kilos. Alexei, named in so honor of Tsar Alexei, Nicholas's favorite, was first born to a reigning Tsar in Russia since the 17th century. It seemed a good omen, a sign of hope. 6 weeks later, the imperial couple became apprehensive. A hemorrhage appeared in Alexei's navel. Months passed, and Alexei was already standing upright in his cradle, starting to crawl and trying to walk. When he stumbled and fell, small spots appeared on his legs and arms. Within a few hours, the spots would puff up and turn a bluish color. Underneath the skin, the blood would not clot. His parents' horrible suspicion was confirmed. Alexei had hemophilia. Hidden from public view, concealed in rumor, operating from within, this hidden tragedy would change the history of Russia and the world. The secret of Alexei's disease was hidden and well kept within the inner limits of Tsarskoye Selo, the Tsar's city. When the child sustained a grave injury, there was little the doctors could do to make him better. The child would lie in agony for days, waiting for the disease to heal on its own. Only when Rasputin arrived did things start to improve, or so they thought. Rasputin was a Siberian monk, reputed to be a healer and a man of gold. Underneath his cloak of sanctity, there was a shy man who indulged in luxury in his spare time. However, he was of lowly and peasant origin. As he became quite close to the imperial family, he encountered a great deal of opposition from the aristocracy. Rasputin started to follow Alexei and live in the imperial family's inner circle. Whenever there was a problem or a worsening of his illness, he would be around to cure the boy. Rasputin's closeness and influence caused several rumors to arise in society, And since then, Nicholas, Alexandra, and Rasputin had their reputations on the line. With the Prime Minister's help, Russia was finally entering the 20th century. The absolute monarchy was being morphed into a form of government more responsive to the people's will. To improve the situation, from 1906 to 1911, Russia had outstanding crops. With the abundance of food, the government raised taxes and maintained a balanced budget. Railroads were built and businesses were established. Press censorship was abolished, and the government grew more liberal in the realm of religious tolerance. To some Marxists, it seemed that the dream of revolution was dead and buried. The successful partnership between the Tsar and Prime Minister Stolypin was only ended in 1911 when the latter was assassinated. Coincidentally, he had launched an inquiry against Rasputin to probe the monk's conduct. With the end of censorship, the press openly spoke of Rasputin as a shadowy mischief maker who controlled appointments in the church and exerted influence over the empress. Moreover, rumors surfaced that the monk and the empress shared the same bed. Nicholas was greatly aggrieved to see his wife's name and honor dragged through the mud. Freedom of speech was something very new to them, but it was off the radar to impose censorship again. The prime ministers who took over the Duma had to display their ability to the Tsar, to the deputies in the Duma, and also to Rasputin. Attempting to confront the monk was a surefire resignation, since Alexandra's protection was all too strong. Until then, Rasputin had only wanted to live his life as a womanizer while trying to help Alexandra's illness. However, his behavior made the news. The Tsar's family and experienced politicians tried to keep him away from the empress. It was then that he realized how powerful he was in politics. A complaint to Alexandra was enough, and the next day his enemies would vanish from the map. The empress defended Rasputin so passionately that it was difficult for the people to disassociate the empress and the monk. Not wanting to set himself against his wife, Nicholas just accepted the situation. In 1913, the golden world of the European aristocracy was at its zenith, but the danger signs were already there. For Russia, 1913 was a year of celebration. The Romanov dynasty had completed 300 years in power. The tricentennial was an outstanding success. As head of the family, Nicholas II presided over the enormous Romanov clan of cousins, uncles, nephews, and nieces. And they were a lot of work for the Tsar, something that eroded the image of the monarchy and the dynasty. The year of celebration was over, and 1914 came with a bang. In May, the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand was murdered. It was the beginning of the Great War. Initially, Nicholas hoped that the Archduke's assassination would not lead to war. Weeks later, it was Rasputin's turn to undergo an attempt on his life, but he recovered painfully. The unexpected happened. Austria gave an ultimatum to Serbia, which in turn asked Russia for help. The classic Russian role as protector of the Slavs and Nicholas II's personal assurance of Serbia's independence were part of the ongoing fabric of European diplomacy. Such a threat to Serbia could only be interpreted as a challenge to Russia's power and influence in the Balkans. The Tsar sought to negotiate with Austria, but they refused. He tried to negotiate with Germany, hoping they would broker a deal, but they also declined. With no settlement, Austria-Hungary began bombing Belgrade, the capital of Serbia, on July the 29th. In St. Petersburg, Tsar Nicholas gave the order to mobilize all Russian military districts on the Austrian borders. Nicholas also thought that the German Kaiser did not want war. However, Germany declared war on Russia on July the 31st. Nicholas wrote of the Kaiser, "He was never sincere, not for a moment." On the afternoon of August 2nd, 1914, at the Winter Palace, the Tsar issued a formal proclamation of hostilities. Crowds filled the streets. From night to day, a wave of patriotism swept over Russia. On August 5th, the German army invaded neutral Belgium. England declared war on the Germans on the same date, joining France and Russia to form the Triple Entente. An ancient tradition demanded that the Russian Tsars commence their wars by going to Moscow, to ask for God's blessing on the landmark pillar of Tsarist rule, the Kremlin. 1 million people welcomed the Tsar in Moscow. Everything seemed fine and the population was euphoric, but Nicholas began to make mistakes. In a gesture of nobility and moralism, the Tsar banned the sale of vodka throughout the territory while the war lasted. The gesture, when military expenses were so high, was considered more noble than wise. The sale of vodka was a state monopoly and earned a considerable percentage of revenue for the imperial government, and prohibition did not put an end to drunkenness in Russia. In a second burst of patriotism, Nicholas changed the capital's name. The German name, St. Petersburg, was changed to the Slavic Petrograd. In numbers of soldiers, Russia was a colossus. The normal pre-war military strength was 1.4 million, but mobilization immediately added 3.1 million reservists. There were millions more behind this initial mass. Russia was, in every respect, except the number of men, ill-prepared for war. The roads were utterly inadequate. For every meter of Russian road per square kilometer, Germany had 10. Industry was small, arms and ammunition were limited, and the country's geography left them stranded. In the first few weeks, the war went smoothly according to the German schedule. During August, the troops advanced through Belgium and northern France. Keeping Russia in the war was essential for the French, as it split the German troops into two fronts. For the French generals, the key to France's salvation lay in getting the Russian colossus moving. It mattered little whether the colossus would find victory or defeat, as long as the Germans were diverted from the overwhelming onslaught on Paris. An early impulse of the Tsar was to take over the troops on the front lines, but he was quickly dissuaded to give up the idea. However, Nicholas kept a close eye on the military and took Alexei with him. It was extremely difficult to get the Empress to let Alexei go. Besides searching troops, father and son traveled through cities, factories, shipyards, and hospitals. For the most part, everything was going well. The disease remained under control, and Nicholas enjoyed the misleading calm and stability that often comes to parents and hemophiliacs. But Alexei had several crises. During one of them, the boy had to return home. The bleeding stopped only after a visit from Rasputin. The Russians noticed, during the first clashes, that the Austrians were a much weaker enemy. The Germans were the problem. By the end of 1914, with only 5 months left in the war, 1 million Russians, a quarter of the army, were dead, wounded, or captured. There was no way to hide from the country what was happening at the front. In less than 6 months, optimism was superseded by pessimism and melancholy. Frightened and heedless of his advisors, the Tsar decided to take command of the troops and go to the front. However, the results continued to be terrible. In 1916, Russia lost 1.2 million men. Since the Tsar was at the front, Alexandra was left in charge of the empire. But Rasputin was the one in charge, since the Empress listened to all of his advice. In the early fall of 1915, Alexandra Feodorovna had been Empress of Russia for 21 years. During this entire time, she had shown little interest in politics and no personal ambition. Except in Rasputin's defense, it was rare that she spoke to the Tsar about government matters. All this changed when Nicholas took command of the army. The void left by him in the civil administration was filled by his wife. It was not a formal regency. It was almost a domestic breakdown of family duties. Lacking experience, Alexandra made several gargantuan mistakes, and many of these blunders came from Rasputin's directions, who was tasked with choosing the good men and the bad men from the cabinet. Alexandra placed no importance on a potential minister's suitability or experience for the job. It only mattered that he was acceptable to the man of God. It was much more important that he liked Rasputin than that he understood anything about ammunition, diplomacy, or food supplies. Although the function informally delegated by Nicholas was only to supervise internal affairs, Alexandra had started to intrude into the area of military operations. In his ultimate self-confidence, Rasputin soon went a step beyond asking questions about the army. and started passing on instructions about the timing and location of Russian attacks. The Empress said that his inspiration came to her in dreams while she slept. Although the Tsar found it natural to allow his wife into military secrets, he did not want her to pass them on to Rasputin. In his letters, he asked her not to communicate the secrets to anyone, but naturally she did not allow for this rule. Rasputin's intervention in military affairs was most evident during the 1916 Great Russian Offensive. This attack was claiming many lives, and Rasputin advised that it was better to go slowly because Russia could not take so many losses. From the front, Nicholas said that he would follow the plan. From Moscow, Alexandra thundered, telling the offensive to stop. Even worse was the economy's ever-increasing ruin and the army's rebellion, bit by bit. Fuel was running out, iron and copper for ammunition as well. Under the strain of his dual role as Tsar and Commander-in-Chief, Nicholas's health and morale began to suffer. To retain control of the Duma, Nicholas sacked the Prime Minister, and Alexander Trepov took over. One of his main goals was to push out Rasputin. By the end of 1916, some sort of change at the top was deemed inevitable. Many still hoped that change could be made non-violently, that the monarch could be altered to provide the nation with a responsible government. Others felt that if the dynasty was to be preserved, there would have to be a brutal purge. On one point, everyone agreed. Rasputin had to be removed. Finally, he was assassinated on December 17, 1916. As to be expected, the impact of Rasputin's death was less severe for Nicholas than for Alexandra. Upon hearing of the loss during a headquarters meeting, the Tsar immediately stood up and telegraphed, "I am horrified, shaken to the core." In the weeks following Rasputin's death, the Tsar underwent a major nervous breakdown. Everyone was shocked by the Tsar's appearance. There were rumors that Alexandra was drugging him. In early March, after 2 months of respite with his family, Nicholas's mood began to improve. He was optimistic that the army, now equipped with new weapons from England and France, could finish the war by the end of the year. The basic problem was lack of food and fuel. The city suffered more than the countryside, of course. Petrograd, farther away from the food and coal-producing regions, experienced even greater shortages. The scarcity drove prices through the roof. Ironically, in the winter of 1917, no serious plans for revolution were being made, either by the workers or the revolutionaries. Living in Zurich, Lenin felt isolated, depressed, and defeated. Nothing he tried seemed to work. On Thursday, March the 8th, as the imperial train was leaving Petrograd to take the Tsar to his headquarters, the long, silent bread line suddenly snapped. Finding it no longer bearable to wait, the people stormed the bakeries and helped themselves. On March the 9th, a crowd took to the streets. On the 10th, most of the workers in Petrograd went on strike. Huge crowds filled the streets, carrying red flags for the first time, and they cried, "Down with war." Some 800 kilometers away, poorly informed by the Prime Minister as to the seriousness of the situation, thinking that the crisis was just yet one among the turbulent strikes that had plagued his entire reign, the Tsar remained in command of his troops. Nevertheless, he issued an order that, if necessary, the troops be used to clear the streets. The strikes and protests continued. Instead of making concessions, the Tsar sent reinforcements. March the 12th was the turning point in Petrograd. By night, power had passed to the Duma. The key to this dramatic turnaround was the mass defection of soldiers who were in Petrograd. By nightfall, 66,000 soldiers joined the demonstrators. Early the next morning, the Tsar learned that his prime minister had been toppled. Events were in full swing at the Duma. It was decided there that the imperial order would be ignored and Kerensky would be in charge of the Duma. On that very day, another parallel power arose, the Petrograd Soviet. All over the city, the revolution was triumphant. Nicholas was shattered. All the generals said he had only one way out: abdication. At first, the Tsar stepped down in favor of his son, Alexei. But then he learned that the whole family would go into exile and Alexei would be taken care of by someone else. As a Tsar, he was well aware that his son, by right, was heir to the Russian throne. As a father, he could not admit to forsaking his son to strangers, unaware of all the implications of his illness. For the second time on that fateful day, Nicholas was compelled to make a dramatic decision. Instead of abdicating in favor of Alexei, he passed the throne to his brother Michael. Aged 39, Michael was completely unprepared for this abrupt transformation. However, in agreement with the Duma, he decided to abdicate. 304 years later, the Romanov dynasty was over. The imperial family was eventually locked up in a kind of detention in the Tsarskoye Selo palace. Upon seeing his wife again, Nicholas collapsed. He laid his head in Alexandra's lap and cried like a child. In August 1917, Kerensky's government, now holding the office of prime minister after Laval's abdication, moved the Romanovs to Tobolsk in the Ural Mountains, claiming that this would protect them from the crescendo of the revolution. There they lived in the former governor's mansion with considerable comfort. On April 30th, 1918, they were moved to their final destination, the Ipatiev House in Yekaterinburg. After the Bolsheviks took power in October 1917, their conditions of imprisonment became strict, and the discussion of putting Nicholas on trial became more frequent. Nicholas followed the events of the October Revolution with interest, but without alarm. He kept underestimating Lenin's sacrifice, but started to feel that his abdication had done Russia more harm than good. In the meantime, he and his family occupied themselves with being cordial. In Yekaterinburg, the Tsar was banned from wearing epaulets, and the sentries doodled obscene drawings on the fence to taunt his daughters. On March 1, 1918, the family was put out to eat soldiers' rations, which meant the departure of 10 devoted servants. From then on, butter and coffee were regarded as luxuries. What kept the family going was the faith that someone would help them. However, for the Bolsheviks, Nicholas II's family and the emperor himself seemed to represent a hope for the White Army, made up of an alliance of anti-communists. The Tsar could even be considered the legitimate ruler of Russia by the European nations if he remained alive. The Romanov family was executed on July 17, 1918, exactly 103 years ago, in this almost explosive context. On that dawn, Tsar Nicholas II, his wife, and all their heirs took part in a terrifying and absolute firing squad. In her book, The Last Days of the Romanovs, author Helen Rappaport reveals some of the most gruesome details of the Tsar's family execution. In total, there were about 70 bullets fired, 7 for each shooter, within a short 20-minute period. According to the author, it all began around midnight on July 17th. Rushing to finish off the prisoners, Commander Yakov Yurovsky demanded that Dr. Eugene Botkin, the Romanovs' physician, wake the entire family and properly dress them. The pretext given by Yurovsky was to take Nicholas II and his heirs to a safe place, which in fact was only a 30-square-meter room. For the Romanovs, the only thing left to do was to wait for a transport truck, which would take them out of there, but dead already. After a few minutes of secrecy, Yurovsky burst through the room's double door and sentenced Nicholas II, reading the order of conviction drawn up by the Ural Executive Committee. The Tsar was surprised, but barely had time to ask any questions. Realizing the situation they were in, Tsarina Alexandra and Grand Duchess Olga tried to make a sign of the cross, but could not finish their prayers. With guns pointed at the family, Yurovsky commanded the firing squad to begin. It was 20 minutes of pure terror, with dozens of shots being fired at point-blank range. The thunder of bullets was so loud that some families sleeping in adjacent rooms woke up in the middle of the night. Nicholas II was instantly killed, with shots being fired at his chest. Alexei, who was 13 years old, was killed, with only 2 fatal shots to the head. However, Alexandra and some of her daughters were not victims of the firing squad, but of a bayonet. For example, the Grand Duchesses Tatiana, 21, Anastasia, 17, and Maria, 19, carried several diamonds on their clothes, which would have protected their bodies from bullets. Yet even though they were crouched against the wall, Maria and Anastasia were killed within seconds, while Tatiana was shot in the head. Immediately after all the family members and their employees were reported dead, the doors to the room were opened to allow the gunpowder smoke to dissipate. The gunned-down bodies were then put into a truck, which took them to their graves. All the bodies were buried near the Gorno-Uralsk railway line. The pit where the corpses were buried was about 60 centimeters deep. To make sure that the Romanovs would not be recognized, their bodies were dipped in sulfuric acid and covered with quicklime. It was the Tsar's final end. In January 1998, the remains excavated under a dirt road near Yekaterinburg in 1991 were identified as those of Nicholas II and his family, excluding one of his daughters and Alexei. The identifications carried out separately by Russian, British, and American scientists using DNA analysis agreed and proved conclusive. In April 2008, Russian authorities reported they had found 2 missing skeletons of the Romanovs near Yekaterinburg. It was confirmed by DNA testing that they belonged to Alexei and one of his sisters. On October 1, 2008, the Russian Supreme Court ruled that Tsar Nicholas II and his family were victims of political repression and must be rehabilitated. The Romanov family was ultimately executed on July 17, 1918. That early morning, Tsar Nicholas II, his wife, and all of their heirs went through a terrifying and absolute firing squad. The Tsar's execution was made public immediately, but the fate of the rest of the family was kept secret, giving rise to countless speculations. Only in 1989 was the discovery of the Romanovs' remains brought to St. Peter and Paul's Cathedral in St. Petersburg in 1998. Shortly thereafter, the Russian Orthodox Church proclaimed the canonization of the imperial family, but this is still a very sensitive and controversial issue within Russian society.